Right, so earlier this week, the Aegean island of Syros became an unexpected front line in the global movement against Israel's war on Gaza. A cruise ship, the Crown Iris, carrying approximately 1,600 Israeli tourists, approached the island's main port, expecting a typical summer welcome. Instead, hundreds of Greek islanders lined the waterfront with banners, Palestinian flags, and chants of defiance. "Stop the genocide" echoed across the harbour as a human blockade formed, preventing passengers from disembarking. After hours of tense standoff, the ship was forced to change course and head towards Cyprus instead, its tourists trapped aboard as unwilling symbols of growing European outrage against Israel's military campaign. This wasn't a spontaneous protest, it was an organised act of solidarity, a statement that business as usual tourism, even on Israel's doorstep as Greece ostensibly is impossible when genocide unfolds in Gaza. Ordinary people just won't have it, and they're making their feelings felt. Right, so while protests and boycotts have long targeted Israeli goods and companies and diplomatic events, and in Greece recently, of course, those dock workers refusing to unload Israeli military cargo, this was one of the first direct actions in Europe to confront Israel's tourism industry head on. Tourism is more than an economic sector, it's a vehicle for soft power, projecting an image of normality and cultural connection that belies the ongoing military occupation of Palestine. By blocking tourists rather than simply demonstrating in the streets, the protesters in Syros challenged that narrative of normality. They forced a confrontation between moral outrage and Israel's economic interests. This act also exposed a deepening rift in Greek society between a public that overwhelmingly sympathises with Palestinians and a government that remains one of Israel's closest European allies. The events in Syros are part of a wider pattern of grassroots resistance happening across Greece, which included those dock workers who repeatedly refused to handle military shipments bound for Israel. Together, these actions highlight the growing power of ordinary citizens and workers to disrupt the economic and logistical networks that sustain Israel's war machine. At the same time, the protests raise further questions. What does this say about Greece's political identity? Can tourism and shipping blockades significantly pressure Israel? Are these protests morally justified, especially when they're targeting civilians? And could such actions spread across Europe, turning the Mediterranean from a space of leisure into a moral battleground? And what are the consequences, both domestically and militarily, for Israel should that happen? Greek public anger at Israel's actions in Gaza has been building for months, though, reflecting a large-scale demonstrations and union-led strikes and increasingly direct forms of resistance. Polling conducted by Greek news outlet Akatha reveals a clear shift in attitudes. Over 35% of Greeks now directly blame Israel for the devastation in Gaza, while only around 20% express sympathy for the Israeli government. More than half the population believes Greece should adopt a more neutral stance, indicating widespread disapproval of Athens' pro-Israel foreign policy. These numbers represent a dramatic reversal from just a few years ago, when pro-Israel sentiment in Greece was relatively high due to shared energy interests and shared anti-Turkish sentiment. The public's anger is rooted in a strong tradition of anti-imperialist and anti-colonial solidarity. Greece has long positioned itself as a supporter of liberation movements, shaped by its own historical experiences of occupation under Ottoman, Nazi, and military junta rule. During the 1980s, the Pan-Hellenic Socialist Movement, PASOK, openly backed the Palestinian Liberation Organization and opposed Israel's occupation policies. That legacy persists amongst Greek unions, amongst leftist parties of today, grassroots activists who view the Palestinian struggle as a continuation of global anti-colonial resistance. And the protests have been widespread and diverse. On the 1st of May last year, as Reuters reported at the time, tens of thousands joined May Day demonstrations that combined calls for better wages with slogans demanding an end to genocide in Gaza. In May of this year, thousands marched to the Israeli embassy in Athens, waving Palestinian flags and denouncing their government's complicity, as documented by the Middle East Monitor. These were not fringe gatherings. They included workers and students and professionals, even Greek soldiers in uniform, who publicly criticised their government's involvement in imperialist plans. The Syros protest is simply the latest example of a broader, more deeply rooted public anger. It's not an isolated local incident, but a logical next step in a movement increasingly willing to move from symbolic solidarity to direct action and disruption. While public opinion has shifted sharply, the Greek government continues to deepen its ties with Israel, though. As Al Jazeera reported in 2023, Greece has become one of Israel's most dependable allies in Europe, driven by shared strategic interests. Athens has signed defence pacts and purchased Israeli drones and surveillance technology and partnered with Israel and Cyprus in the East Med gas pipeline project. Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis' visit to Jerusalem in March of this year, at the height of Israel's assault on Gaza, just nails that point on even more firmly. But the government's reaction to the Syros protests reflects this pro-Israel stance as well, as you might well imagine it probably does. Officials condemned the blockade as outrageous and suggested it reflected rising anti-Semitism within their own country, echoing those overused and tediously dull Israeli government talking points. It needs calling out and slamming wherever that happens. Conflating criticism of Israel's policies with anti-Semitism not only undermines legitimate protest, but is itself a form of anti-Semitism. Where many Zionists will point to the IRA definition of anti-Semitism and its examples at this point, this simply highlights the flaws of the definition. It assumes all Jews support Israel's actions, reducing Jewish identity to a single political stance and erasing the voices of Jewish groups who opposed that war, such as Jewish Voice for Peace and Holocaust survivor organisations. Far from protecting Jewish communities, this rhetoric fuels resentment by falsely portraying all Jews as collectively responsible for Israel's crimes. The Greek government's attempts to delegitimise protest by weaponising accusations of anti-Semitism is just another cynical manoeuvre designed to protect its foreign policy interests and not that of global Jewry. As one protester told Press TV, it's unacceptable that tourists from Israel continue to be welcomed here while the Palestinians are suffering in the Strip. The Syros blockade was significant not only for its symbolism, but also for its strategic implications. Tourism is a key sector for Israel's soft power, presenting a narrative of normality and cultural engagement to the world. Israeli tourists vacationing freely in European resorts sends a message of integration and acceptance. By blocking these tourists, Greek protesters have disrupted that narrative. They've forced a confrontation between Israel's carefully cultivated image and the reality of its actions in Gaza. Israeli tourists represent a growing market for Greek islands, especially in the Aegean. According to the Greek travel pages, disruptions to tourism could have significant financial repercussions if they deter Israeli visitors or spark wider unrest that discourages other nationalities from travelling. Israel has already issued travel advisories warning its citizens to be cautious in Greece. Now, some might say, well, Greek dock workers blocking military cargo is one thing, but are tourists legitimate targets of political activism here? Protesters argue that while individual tourists may not be personally responsible for their government's actions, Israel's system of militarism relies on economic and cultural normalization abroad. By refusing to treat Israeli tourists as just another nationality, protesters aim to disrupt that normalization. Besides, if they can enjoy vacations while people starve in Gaza, then they are complicit whether they want to be or not, surely, knowing what their government that they may well support is doing. Syros protest is part of a larger wave of Greek resistance centred in its ports. The dock worker unions, particularly Enedep in Piraeus, have repeatedly refused to handle military shipments bound for Israel. Last year, Piraeus dockers blocked ammunition cargo as well. Earlier this month, as I covered in another video, they refused to unload military-grade steel from the Ever Golden vessel, with hundreds of union members physically preventing the shipment's onward transport. These actions were supported by grassroots activists, turning the port into a temporary zone of resistance and again in defiance of the Greek government. The union stance was unequivocal. It was also revealed by Squawk Box as dock workers refused to load 5 further shipments of military-grade steel, pledging to continue such actions as long as the genocide persists. These blockades are not isolated to Greece either. They are part of a Europe-wide and increasingly Mediterranean-wide movement that includes dock worker unions in France, Sweden, Spain and Morocco. Together, these actions are disrupting Israel's supply chains, raising shipping insurance costs and delaying arms deliveries. More importantly, they demonstrate how ordinary workers can directly influence foreign policy, bypassing governments that refuse to act. The combination of tourism protests and logistics blockades poses a growing threat to Israel's economic and diplomatic standing. Tourism boycotts undermine Israel's image as a normal state integrated into the global economy, while port blockades hit directly at its military and industrial supply chains. If similar actions spread to other Mediterranean countries especially, Israel could face significant economic pressure. For Greece, the stakes are high as well. The Piraeus Chamber of Commerce has warned, as reported by that same Greek Travel Pages article, that Middle East instability threatens Greek tourism and trade, with potential losses in the hundreds of millions. Marini noted that shipping disruptions and rising insurance costs could further strain Greece's already fragile economy. The government faces a difficult choice here. Crack down on protests to protect trade with Israel, risking domestic unrest, or tolerate them and risk diplomatic friction with Tel Aviv and Washington. Do the right thing, frankly, is my view. Who do you represent at the end of the day? Who elected you? Shouldn't be a hard choice not to side with the unforgivable. The Syros blockade certainly raises questions about the role of ordinary citizens in confronting state violence. But against the backdrop of government inaction, why should people just tolerate this? Surely that's what Israeli tourists are doing versus their own government's actions. Or inaction, as the case may be. If elected bodies, governments and the like, do nothing in the face of genocide, why should we all be tarred by the same brush, is the only question that actually seems relevant to me here. For decades, governments have determined foreign policy with little input from their citizens, and too often that is influenced by other nations at that. UK foreign policy, for example, is basically made in Washington and has been for years. The Syros tourism blockade is more than a single protest, therefore. It's a symbol of a broader revolt against complicity. Greek protesters have demonstrated that solidarity can be disruptive, strategic and effective, targeting both the military logistics that sustain Israel's war and the soft power industries that sustain its image. The Greek government may attempt to suppress these protests, branding them anti-Semitic and dangerous, but the moral tide is turning and people certainly aren't having it anymore. They're certainly less afraid of being labelled, as they once were perhaps as well. Ordinary Greeks, dock workers, students, islanders are asserting their agency in ways their elected officials refuse to do, though. As these protests continue, Israel may find that Europe's beaches and ports, long seen as neutral spaces of commerce and leisure, are becoming moral battlegrounds and becoming off limits to them as they have made food off limits to Gaza. If Greece can turn its tourist havens and shipping hubs into sites of resistance, then others may well follow, and so they should. And when that happens, the economic and diplomatic cost of genocide will no longer be confined to the battlefield. It'll reach into every port, every cruise terminal, every resort or hotel that currently still chooses to remain silent. For more on the dock workers' strike and the dramatic impact that has caused, check out this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch. Please do also hit like, share and subscribe if you haven't done so already, so as to ensure you don't miss out on all new daily content, sort of spreading the word and helping to support the channel at the same time, which is very much appreciated. Holding power to account for ordinary working class people, and I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.